Welcome to the Learning Reinvented Podcast, brought to you by myself, James Poletyllo, and the team from the Learning Effect. There are lots of learning podcasts out there, but we wanted to do something slightly different. In this episode, we'll be looking at the impact of corporate learning functions and some of the factors that play into that. So to help us explore this subject, I'm delighted to welcome Paul Jocelyn to the podcast. Welcome, Paul.
Thanks, James. I really appreciate this.
Well, it's great that you can join us today. Do you want to, before we delve into looking at learning transformation and some other stuff, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background?
Yeah, thanks, James. Let me do that. My name's Paul Jocelyn. I guess in summary, I've spent the last 30 years helping organisations become the next thing that they need to be, quite simply. So I've had a long and varied career with Tesco. Started off as an operator there, grew up through the stores, moved into a head office function, into the marketing division. So in the UK, projects, programs, built out the marketing operating model that eventually went around the group, so into Asia and Central Europe. And really that way of thinking about how the organisation would centralise the right things and then leave local markets with the autonomy to do what they do best was really a way into capability, a way into learning what are the things that we need to do one way and what are the things that we should leave people to grow and understand for themselves. The last 6 years, I've been working as a freelance consultant and advisor to lots of different organisations, L&D leaders, HR leaders, CEOs, COOs, who are really finding that challenge of the way that we approach and enable learning has got us to a point, but we now need something different. We now need more from that function, and we need more from our investments to allow us to become something more sustainable and more growth oriented.
And in preparation for this discussion, I've taken a lot of time to sort of delve through your blog, and I found myself smiling away at some of the
Thank you.
To the point observations, real truisms and stuff I reflect on and have recognised through my career as well. And there are so many different areas I think we could focus in on, but I wanted to start with a bit of a quote that was out of your last blog post. So in there you say most corporate L&D is performance theatre, events management. There's huge amounts of investment in trying to improve the performance of individuals without a focus on system change, alluding to it being a bit of a cult. So do you want to expand on those sort of thoughts a little bit?
Yeah, I think an interesting start point is to consider, where did L&D come from? What was it for? And also, who was it for? So if we think about how organizations became successful and what were the features and characteristics of a sustainable business, and invariably that was about taking a business model, developing an operating model to support that, refining it, honing it, and driving ever more consistency of execution. So if we think about the role of L&D or HR or learning, big vague suitcase word, learning, it's not surprising that its understandable focus was on enabling that consistency and standardization. And an approach to support that compliance and consistency, i.e. training, makes perfect sense in that setting. So if we think about those organizations, you've probably got a really clear separation between the people that own strategy, right at the top of the pyramid, who we are and what we do and who for, the people that then enable that strategy, so folks in organizational design, so thinking about structures, roles and responsibilities, teams, handoffs. And then you've got kind of HR ensuring the policies and processes and procedures are correct around that. And then you kind of got L&D probably at the bottom of that food chain, as it were, who've just then got to go and train the stuff in. So in that era, again, it makes good sense. What capabilities do we need? What is it that people need to know? How are we going to ensure they know it? What's our measurement of knowing? What's our unit of knowing, which is probably the course and attendance of that course? And then we just go deliver. I'd argue that the world is far more complex and always was. And if we look at creating valuable businesses today and businesses that are sustainable now and looking ahead, there's a very different balance between creating value by ensuring we've standardized all the workers and they're doing what we need them to do in the way that we need them to do it, and supporting that through training, versus creating an environment within which we can work out the next thing we're going to do, and we can enable people to fulfill their potential, and we can create the environment and the conditions within which we can achieve our strategy. And I'd argue that L&D's focus still remains, despite that shifting context, overly focused on compliance in the broadest sense, not just compliance as in here's our health and safety legislation to ensure that we don't go to court, but broadly everything's about somebody there's decided what you need to know. We are the conduit through which you're going to know one way, and then we're going to track that. And I'd argue that that balance on productive learning for individuals, whilst we don't recognise the broader system or attempt to influence and facilitate changes in the system, is kind of kidding people and often leading them on. It's performance theatre, as I mentioned in that blog.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, that, you know, as you said, knowing where something's come from sort of shapes exactly what it's there to do, and we're then into realms of some of the other things you talk about in your blog posts as well. So there's one where you talk about sort of budget and what we're expected to do from the delivery of budget and what that drives us to deliver. And I think there's some very similar themes in that post as well, about, you know, there's the tried, the tested, the expected stuff that we've done in the past. And I recognize that, and I'm sure many other people do, that they've inherited or been part of building or shaping or evolving something that is from that ilk of the history of driving compliance, as you said, one way of doing things, consistency, creating a customer experience, a brand experience. All of those things are coming from positive intent of, you know, trying to do those things. And now we've seen a shift. And you said it's always been there, but we're seeing a shift that maybe the expectation is that we're there to deliver something else. So if someone is faced with that sort of history, budgetary expectation, stakeholder expectation, what can they do to shift that or to move that some way?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of ways of slicing that differently, reframing it, if you like. So just to consider, as an example, how much of our work is focused on the individual, how much of our work is focused on teams, how much of our work is focused on enabling the overall organisation. And that can be quite a telling assessment or even audit of where time and money is being put in terms of the L&D budget and focus. Because invariably, in my experience, again, as I mentioned earlier, the vast majority of that seems to be going on individuals. You know, fix individual performance, and then collectively, somehow, that will sum up to sort of magic moments, and we'll become a different organisation. So that challenge and very deliberate reset between focusing more on teams and being clear on the overall organizational shifts you're trying to facilitate, you're trying to accelerate, can be an interesting lens to put on the work. Another lens to put on the work, as an example, can be, in kind of fancy terms, productive learning versus generative learning. So again, in terms of productive learning, here's the stuff on our agenda, on our curriculum, on our budget, on our backlog, that's focused on the stuff we already do, maintaining, ensuring, and over time making that slightly better, optimizing it as we go. Versus what you'd call the generative stuff, which is how do you create opportunities and space and time for people to collectively or individually, mostly collectively, I think, work out the next thing and why. And again, invariably, a bit like the first example, it's all on the individual. Generally, you find the focus is on the productive stuff, getting better at what we already do, making it 0.5% improved year on year, putting time on the stuff that we already know about, versus space and expectation on the next thing. Can be a second interesting lens. The third way of slicing and reflecting and challenging, as an example, as a tool, can be, okay, if we divided our work into 3 circles and we said, here the focus is on aligning stuff. We're now headed here as an organization. Our work should be about collectively getting people on that track, on these buses, because we want alignment. We see there's value in that, and that's helpful and productive and valuable where we need alignment. So where would we focus on that? And what would the right set of tactics and tools be if we're talking about getting people aligned? That might be where some of that compliance stuff comes in. The second bucket in terms of work and investment could be, okay, where do we need to enable stuff? We're not here now. We need to be more of. We need to be faster at. We need to accelerate. We need to become. We need to create. And again, what proportion of our time and effort should we be putting on that, given where the organization says it wants to go? And what are the appropriate tools and tactics? Because that'll be quite different from the appropriate tools and tactics in the aligning list. And then the third bit, in terms of L&D's focus, the third bucket could be disrupt. It can be really uncomfortable. But where's the thing where kind of actually we need to help people see the barrier. We need to help people shift. We're going to actively, this again is another big opportunity and tricky to do in my experience. Here's some stuff we're going to stop. It's disruptive because we're not going to do any more of that. We're not going to do so much of that. We're going to do this instead, i.e. the other stuff, the aligning, the enable. So just thinking about, there's 3 examples there of different ways that an L&D leader, function, all of the people in that kind of cohort could reset and reframe their work. So the idea of productive versus generative, the idea of align, enable, disrupt, the idea of the individual versus a team versus the business overall.
I love the lenses there, because I think, your approach, probably the approach we take with clients as well, is to go in and ask those questions or enable that reflection, because when you're in the mire of something, you can't easily step back. I mean, you can, but you don't always see those things. It's sometimes having that helpful person who's going to facilitate that, enable that, whether, like you said, that's in the pub or that's elsewhere in terms of you doing that. But those people stepping back and thinking, right, for all good intentions, we've got these things that are where we are, and we've got, probably, as you said, a focus on stuff that's focused on an individual, that's trying to shape us to stay where we are, or improve by small percentage points to drive consistency, etc. And the uncomfortable stuff, which is that transformation, the enable, the disrupt stuff that is really going to move us somewhere else. And you also talked a little bit back around that hierarchy of, you've got people who are doing strategy, then you've maybe got some workforce planning or people doing stuff on that, then you've got the HR policy and process, and L&D sits further down that chain. Now,
Yeah.
interestingly, the L&D people I've met who really drive that transformation don't see themselves at the bottom of that chain. They're the ones who see themselves more in that almost grasping the workforce planning, workforce strategy piece, as well as the L&D piece, because I've seen a lot of success from colleagues, clients, organizations I've been where someone grabs both of those sides of that and sort of circumvents some of the rules and regulations, because they're recognizing that they need to try and move the paradigm of where we're going and shift and break things and think about a different future. But then, like I think you quite nicely summed up, the compliance stuff comes in there to help align people towards that new future as well. So you don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater necessarily. So given all of that stuff we've talked about, in one of the other posts you've put on your blog, you talk about learning transformation being a niche. Now, considering it seems to be, almost quite needed across learning teams, why is it so rare to see a good learning transformation?
Well, in that post, I talk about, as we've touched on here, what isn't a niche? Well, let's back into this. What do we mean by learning and what do we mean by transformation? So in most organizations, to the earlier ideas, when we say learning, that's still a sort of shorthand proxy for training. Really,
yeah,
that's still the interpretation, the kind of industrial education complex, courses and resources, the schooling model that we all grew up with and the expectation of most leaders. So what there is a huge, ravenous, never-ending machine that is finding new ways, tools, tactics, and logistics around modernizing training. So the fundamentals of that are still that old centralized model, I'd argue. Here's our curriculum, here's our expectation, we have content, we ensure that people can consume that content. Something magic happens, kind of Superman in the telephone box moment, and then the business changes, as people re-enter into the sunshine. So there's a huge industry of vendors, suppliers, technologies, courses, the whole ecosystem, the whole infrastructure. I mean, you said podcasts, but that would have been a bit not this one, James. Around that very thing, that kind of comfortable plateau on which the industry kind of continues to exist, I think. So I think when we talk about learning transformation, we need to be clear on those terms of reference. If we're talking about new ways to modernize, often through digital technology, access and consumption of content and or training, that's a vast, never-ending, as I say, machine like multi-billion dollar industry. But organizations are investing in that, but aren't necessarily becoming better at learning. So I don't think there's a direct correlation between the investment in your learning transformation program as an element of your overall program suite and becoming a learning organization. as
Yeah.
defined in, kind of Senge or whatever. So I think often what it's doing is simply what we've always done, but optimizing that to do it cheaper through technology. If the target is more content more quickly, then if that's what you're measuring. But that's very different to, we're acknowledging the role of learning in our culture as a strategic driver of value, which is about challenging our preconceived ideas on failing, status, what happens if things go wrong, what do we mean by critical thinking, or psychological safety, all of those things that are kind of the systemic features and characteristics of learning faster, learning more effectively, creating more value together. Much of that has got little, if anything, to do with courses, resources, technology, tools, and platforms.
Absolutely, and I think it's inescapable to see the multi-billion-dollar industry that is the content production, content sharing, all of the tech that sits behind things is, as you said, the industrialization or fine-tuning of that traditional, classroom delivery model, sage on the stage now, whatever that happens to be in terms of courses, resources, etc. So moving to those other things you're talking about, which is, learning being a key part of a strategic driver, being part of the future of the organization and not just consumption of knowledge or sharing of resources. How do organizations truly embrace that? Because even in my experience, the new organizations that pop up seem to just want to almost pick up and replicate some of those traditional ways of learning. There doesn't seem to almost be a blueprint or a vision or something that people can say this is what good looks like, or this is what that learning function or learning culture or learning strategy could be, that's different to that one we've inherited from the sort of industrial driven past.
Yes. Exactly. Yeah, so I think the point you make about, as organizations perhaps start to scale, they inevitably kind of default, they kind of reach for this almost this strange sense of security. And then the compliance piece become, in terms of what I call pure compliance, as in regulatory and kind of staying on the right side of the law, and rightly so. And I think one of the underlying drivers is there is this sort of comfortable collusion almost. I mean, collusion is quite a strong word, but I mean, I've worked with lots of organizations. I think L&D know what it's not and what it is, and kind of leaders sort of are in on it too. So they kind of know that it's sort of, I use this theatre word, but actually some of the things we talked about in the last few minutes, the status quo is not great, but the alternative is even harder. And most of that is on quote unquote leaders rather than the L&D function. So I think if you said, well, we're gonna create a system within which productivity means learning faster, and what are the features and characteristics of the way we're going to set ourselves up around here? So if we think about the features of what you'd call the system, what are we going to measure? What are we going to value? What are we going to reward? What are we going to talk more about and less about? What are we going to ask of people? How are things going to work around here, and what are the features and characteristics of the foundation we're going to put down on the walls and the roof we're going to put on it? And within that, we're going to think about learning as not something that's separate from the work that can get kind of deprioritized when we're busy, or people just need to put a day or an hour a week aside for it, or and then we can get on with the real stuff. We're going to think about learning in the sense of from and through and at work all the time, and we're going to acknowledge that most of that comes from people doing stuff. Most of it, kind of the next big opportunity, big kind of contributor is people working together with their peers, with their teams, with their colleagues, with people from outside the organization. And then the smallest part of it is probably the sort of formal stuff that we organize that's sort of in a course or some sort of program that we do over here. So if we're going to set our stall out to organize ourselves, build ourselves around that, stick to those principles, where might we become? But the problem is, you know, most organizational cultures are still quite target oriented, task oriented. You know, once you introduce sort of targets, you're not going to get honesty, in the sense of, you know, people are going to naturally start to prioritize what's expected, and those things can get eroded. So I think one of the challenges, you talked before about this idea of you know, L&D separate from the strategy piece. I think what L&D have tried to do, which I do get to an extent, is this whole kind of seat at the table, voice at the table business. I think what they've done is, consciously or not, tried to become more like the functions that get that airtime and respect and engagement at the top. So if you look at a typical quote unquote learning strategy or capability strategy, it looks very much like, it has the same features and characteristics as, you know, the marketing plan, the procurement plan, the finance plan, the ops plan. And I think, again, understandably, in L&D's defense for a minute, they kind of tried to go down that sort of programmatic milestone. So you think about the language, you know, learning measures, learning requirements, all of these things are very much in that same mindset. I think playing to the security and the expectation that this is what's going to get us respect, and this is what's going to get the function on the pitch. Whereas actually, kind of most organizations need less of that, not more. And they definitely need some people that are helping to connect, because it's all very messy, this intersection between strategy, talent, horrible word, kind of culture, learning. All these things were, you know, in the old days, up to the last sort of 5 years, even, you know, pre-pandemic, still quite siloed and quite distinct. You know, somebody did OD, somebody did learning, somebody. Whereas now, I think, which is really tough for those sort of industrial organizations, there's this sort of messy overlap and kind of linkages, and it's all slightly, you know, difficult to unpick. So I think back to this idea of what's L&D for and who's it for, somebody needs to be doing that work. What's now valuable and differentiating? Is it becoming more compliant and having, you know, more standardized workers and more compliant workers? Well, in some areas of the businesses, yes, but for the most part, no. What we need is people who can think like that, people who can contribute in this way, people who feel ready to, people who, okay, so how do we put out more of our effort, more of our time into enabling that? But that's a huge, again, understand, a huge political risk, isn't it? For people that have grown up in a certain way, a part of that system. And as I say, there's this odd sort of, I know that you know that I know that you know.
The collusion word, or, you know, I know it's a strong word, but I've seen a lot of that in my career, and I've, you know, I always liken it to almost the emperor's new clothes, that we all know that it's going on, but we all happily sit and, you know, sort of cheer along. It's, you know, I've seen we talk about measurement, and I think you make a really good point about how people seek that seat at the top table. I think that's a really interesting view of it, that you've got to almost put on the clothes of everyone else so that you fit at that top table. And, you know, it's the dressing up in someone else's clothes, like putting on your dad's clothes and pretending you're grown up type thing, when that's not really what you want to do. But again, and you sort of play into that, and I've seen this happen in my career, and I've been that disruptive person who doesn't, or sometimes calls out the fact that it is the emperor's new clothes, because I remember landing in one organization and picking up a load of talent programs. They were draining most of our resource was going into training the hypos, and we could show that these hypos got promoted. So there was a way to show that the value this added to organizations, or that this led to more promotions, or this was cutting down or saving external hires into, so there was a way of cost justifying it. However, anyone who was selected by their manager, regardless of about whether they went on these programs, was likely to get promoted and were likely to stop an external hire. So the value of the actual program, or was the value in the process of recognition and line management sponsorship, and trying to step back and say, let's try and understand where this is and where we're really adding value and where should we be putting support and etc. becomes quite challenging, because you're then challenging that status quo. Our budgets were wrapped up in those programs. So as soon as you start saying, well, maybe we don't need to spend as much on those programs, which are overly heavy, you're not then trusted to retain that budget, to say, well, actually, that's our budget. I want to, take that over there because we're going to do something new. We're going to do something that's going to, help us disrupt, help us think more disruptively, or enable people in a different part of the business. And that can be really hard in transformation, because you are got this history of where the budgets come from, what people expect, what you're expected to deliver. Someone else is expecting to get on that program next year, and you move that ladder up the organization, or whatever it happens to be. So change can be really, really difficult in those aspects. And it's then thinking about, in an organization, how do you reposition yourself and start to create the value in the things you should be doing. And the other point I think you made around trying to drive, say, learning, or the ability to fail or experiment or learn quickly, and all of those things, is so intrinsically tied to management culture, performance, reward, and the risk aversion in built into many organizations, that even trying to put those things in, unless you've got those functions or that culture, your reward team, your wider HR team, your senior leadership team, all of those things aligned, you can try them, but they tend to be initiatives that either sit in a very small pocket because you've got a leader who's going to provide you with air cover, or you've got elements of, they will be an initiative, or they won't necessarily last unless you can prove those tangible old school benefits of, this is making us more efficient, it's saving us budget, it's doing this, it's got a direct line to sales, or whatever it happens to be. So I think moving within those cultures that are very set, and those measures and the structures that are very set, makes it quite difficult for anyone. And there are loads of L&D people out there trying to do those things, but they're often butting up against one or multiple of these challenges as they're doing it.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a thing, it's a few years ago now. Again, it's on the blog, around insurgency tactics for L&D, and kind of thinking like an insurgent. And there's one in there that's never, I think of the exact words, never fight a fixed battle against a stronger force. So basically saying, you need to acknowledge where those power bases are in a system.
Mm-hmm.
Know how to pay your dues to that, but then be able to work with it and around it in order to kind of enable what you want to enable. I mean, again, there's a blog on it quite recently. I talked about, most of the senior people that sign off these sorts of programs don't really want to know if it will work. Just leaving a pause there. Which is a terrible thing to say, isn't it? But, I would challenge folks listening to this. If you're really honest, much of the time that's true. Because if you look at the sign-off process, there's never any comeback, really, in terms of business metrics. What you've got is a very kind of self-contained project, and the terms of reference, and the success criteria, training needs analysis, or most of the kind of tools and structures in this space are really about ensuring a lack of accountability. So we kind of created this thing that's sort of, it's a win-win really, or nobody loses. And as I say, there is this sort of strange collusion in that. And I think the seat at the table bit is really strong, and it's again another sort of self-fulfilling prophecy in that you want to aim to please, therefore that reinforces this kind of order taking thing. This is what we need, we'll go and get it done, and therefore you're in this getting stuff done, right? What are the tactics, what are the tools, like deliver, and again it's sort of continuing to embed, with all good intention, that same system. It's kind of reinforcing it rather than helping people to kind of see it and challenge. There's a really good book called Teaming, by a lady called Amy C. Edmondson, who's sort of call her the queen of psychological safety. She's written so much on that. I mean, fantastic kind of insight. I mean, she's a sort of Harvard professor. But one of the things she talks about in this particular book in Teaming is being really focused on the type of work that we're supporting, because, and she talks about in this example 3 different types, so kind of sort of process work that we've touched on a lot. So in her examples, talks about a typical factory sort of setting, which is really rightly focused on continuous improvement, small marginal gains. How do you continue to hone and refine? So what tool set and tactics and strategy would you bring to that setting? But then you've got kind of along that spectrum of uncertainty, because again, it's a bit like that productive work in the factory. We've kind of been doing this for a long time. We know what works. We're just looking for marginal gains. Then she talks about kind of collaborative work. So in her example, a hospital. So on the one hand, you've got people coming in for sort of pre-planned procedures. There's your scheduled date, your operation. We know the process. We're just moving people through the system on time. There's your slot. But at the other end of the hospital, you've got, literally accident and emergency. Every minute of every day is very different. What's the mindset you need there? What are the different skills? How do teams need to work? What's the different, what are the features of that? So again, from an enabling capability perspective, how would you support that? What are your tools and tactics? What's in your armory? Versus the far end of the spectrum, which is where there's most uncertainty, which is classic innovation work, cure for cancer, whatever. So again, what's the mindset at play there? What are the kind of people that are involved in that? What are their needs? How do you create that environment? What leverage do you need? So again, very different approaches, tools and tactics that you'd need to bring to bear. So again, this idea of, back to some of those things we talked about earlier, the different framing, focusing on the work rather than what gets me on the pitch. Again, it's hard, the politics. How to be, let's call this episode how to be a bit more of an insurgent, thinking about the work. And if you go in via the work, you can build a different type of relationship, in my experience, because you're much more empathetic, you're much more in listening mode. You're thinking about, well, what does a high performer do, and how do we do more of that? What are the lessons that they've learned? How do you amplify that? How do you create platforms? How do you accelerate that stuff? Because again, one of the other things I think it's interesting to think about, to challenge, to reflect. On the one hand, you've got most of the leaders who sign this stuff off aren't responsible for if it works. Tumbleweed. But you've got this other challenge of nobody can really define what they mean by high performer or high performance, because what they mostly mean is highly compliant, people who are good at doing it what they're told, people who are good at doing it the way we've said. And again, in this great shift within organizations, so this perfect storm as I describe it, so you got this pressure. It used to be enough just to get cheaper every year, optimize, make people redundant, standardize, offshore. That drove quote unquote value. Just become leaner, become more efficient, standardize, optimize. That's no longer enough. That's not good. That's not good enough if you want to create ongoing value, be a sustainable business. Like we've sort of almost exhausted those tools. So you got that pressure of you need to find other ways pushing down, and then what's pushing up is very different expectations of people. If I'm going to choose employment, because now I've got lots of other options, I can be a freelancer, I can start my own business, I can be part of a network, all of these different options for people in what we'd call knowledge work mostly. But my expectation, if I'm going to join an organization, of the network I'll build, the opportunities I'll get, the way that you'll enable my learning, the way that you recognize me as an individual is very different. So you've got this perfect storm of all the old approaches just to create value and just drive costs out are no longer enough, because you can't just look to finance and procurement for the answers every year. And now these people coming in are not just grateful because we've got the values on the wall and we've got this great academy and can you just answer these emails and complete your training on time. So you kind of got this perfect storm, and in the middle there's an opportunity to respond in a new way in some of the things that we've discussed in this podcast, I think. So again, that idea of what do you mean by a high performer? What does high performance mean? Does it mean get stuff done on time, never has tasks in the backlog, completes as requested, turns up never late, turns up to every meeting? No, I think what we're looking for is a very different set of qualities, a very different set of expectations, somebody who can bring questions and empathy and creativity and be the best of themselves. So again, how are we recognizing that within what we still call the L&D function? How are we tailoring and tuning our investments, our prioritization to create space for that and that recognition of that? So I think, yeah, you're right. The system is the system. It works because it's plausible. It works because often people in positions of power benefit. We're naive to think that that's going to change anytime soon or overnight, or we're going to be embraced to sort of deconstruct that brick by brick. No, but I think what we can do is to say things like acknowledging the order taker and the tactics first bit, thinking about some of these refocusing opportunities, teams via individuals, disrupting via aligning, and all of these things allow us to take some control back as learning leaders, L&D leaders, and reshape that towards something different.
I think, you touched upon the insurgency tactics, the influence, all of those things right up the organization. You also talked about the seat at the table. And I think those approaches go all the way up from, anyone in any learning function looking at how they're moving that dial, what within their element of control, they're still serving the old model, taking orders, but trying to, edge and move along to where they should be. And the people who gain that seat at the table, they've put on someone else's clothes. They're now, trying to be something else. But when they get there, and this is what I've seen a lot in my career, people who get to that seat on the table are almost so grateful that they're there that all they ever do is just sit there and wait for the people thing to be talked about, or yes. The order to be very clear. Oh, we've got this, bit of legislation that's come out. Can you deliver a training course on this? Or we've got to worry about, equality and diversity. That sounds peoply. There's your HR, that goes to your HR director or your learning team. And it's about recognizing, as you said, what does high performance look like? How do we influence that? And that's right across the board. So if you're sat at that table, how are you influencing that thinking? How are you moving that agenda on, that it's not just sort of very nuts and bolts, but you're helping at each of those levels, to help move that towards something that might look very different. And I think the lens of the work you're doing is really important as well, that you touched upon from that. We're in that factory, the marginal gain stuff, through to we're in this completely, creative, trying, like as you said, cure for cancer, or trying to do something that's new or revolutionary, or changing how our business model works, or something that is really creative, and how we empower that and split those things out, because we often look at good practice and one way of doing L&D, and again, you see this from people that there is almost this, that's what learning is. It's a set of programs, a set of stuff that's driving these outputs, and it is so much more than that. And there's a multitude of different things we are servicing, whether that's learning or HR or workforce development, and sometimes it's not necessarily always owned by you. It's that collaboration across the piece as well. And I found that working across with stakeholders who've all got some skin in the game, beyond your function. You don't need to own it, you just need to be part of the rebel alliance that's sort of driving that thinking through the organization, because you can't do it on your own. What you do need is those elements of collaboration, those other people who recognize and will benefit from this, because otherwise you will be a lone voice and very easily picked off.
I think there's, and we've touched on these in a roundabout sort of way, but I think there is this very common kind of, it's a real break, as in a handbrake, sort of perfect storm. And if you dig around, as I do, it sounds quite sad, doesn't it? So, certainly in sort of advising work and consulting work, even in some of the contract work, you look at what are quite typical, I think they're often generic as well, sort of, learning mission statements, learning strategy. There'll be a bit of a sort of boilerplate thing on the intranet somewhere, on the academy. And there's two really interesting reoccurring features. As we've touched on, when they say learning, they really mean accessing content and courses. And when they say strategy, again, that's really a shorthand for tools and tactics. So what we seem to struggle with still is, is a really good definition of strategy. A guy called Jason Yip, who says strategy is three things. It's insight, guiding policy, coherent actions. So again, I think there's a challenge between the difference between a goal, a strategy, and a tactic. In L&D, they become quite interchangeable. They are sort of Trojan horse mythology, Greek legend, is goal, get Helen back, strategy, deception, tactic, wooden horse. And I like that one. Take that, James.
It's nice and simple and easy to visualize.
Yeah. So, and I think what we struggle with in L&D is the separation between those, because, as I say, when we say strategy, actually we're often talking about tactics, tools, technologies, platforms, suppliers, vendors, whatever. So that idea of how do we elevate that? We're enabling the organization to become, we're positioning learning as, okay, I get the goal there, because there's a real tension in that opportunity. Okay, and the strategy is going to be about, enabling or accelerating more collaboration, lifting up exemplary performers, spending more time looking outside for new inspiration. Okay, well, we've got some strategies there. And what will be the best? Back to the teaming, Amy Edmondson. Is it the factory? Is it the hospital? Is it the, innovation for curing a disease? Okay, so there'll be more appropriate tools and tactics that are better aligned towards that one, that one, or that one. So that, I think, again, that's a good stress test for half two. Take a really kind of cool, calm, critical look at those mission statement, strap lines, probably in a reception somewhere as well, on the wall behind the desk. And again, when we're saying learning, is it really a shorthand interpretation for just pushing training, content oriented stuff? And when we say strategy, we're really talking about tactics.
I think a couple of really useful things there. So, just understanding what the wording means, because I know I've certainly been into projects or organizations where that clarity of what those things mean, and when you're talking, you can be at cross purposes because you think you're talking about A and they're talking about pushing courses out or whatever, and you've been hired to fight the wrong war. You think you're not going to do deception, you're going to flood and 10,000 troops in, and actually no, you've got to be the deception expert or whatever it happens to be. So I think there's some the understanding of where everyone is and is really important, and to clarify that, but also, as you said, just using that simple structure to break it down and think about, right, if this is our goal, what strategies are we doing, and then what are the tactics and things that are going to fall out from under that, can help someone just look at things differently. So I think across the conversation today, you've really helped give people lots of lenses to look at their challenge and the area they're looking at, to help them view that differently and to help find some clarity and ways through, so that they can be that insurgent renegade making the change, because they're still operating within the wider machine. So I think having those lenses can help create clarity and some routes through and some things for people to do, so it isn't just these are the problems and it's insurmountable. There are some actions you can definitely take.
Yeah, and I think these sorts of, in my experience, because it's hard to get going, it's hard to stop stuff, it's hard to start new things, it's even harder to stop old things, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think acknowledging that, but being very deliberate around, okay, where might we start? And that's where some of these kind of framings, lenses can come in, because they really allow you to sort of in quite a detached way. Because the trouble is, inevitably in all our work, we spent a lot of time and effort in that program, and we've worked with this supplier for such a long time, and it was such a challenge to get it over the line, and we had all of these twists and turns in the projects, and rightly, we're really proud of this stuff. So it's kind of hard to be detached, isn't it? And kind of look at your children in that way, in a way that's different and new. And these things can help. Again, kind of in the blog, and it was an article I'd published in the training zone. We talked about so where does your agenda come from? What is it that's kind of driving why you do what you do in the way that you do it? And often you'll get, well, this happened in the business and we were asked to run over here and look at this, or the business was a challenge over here and we had to reduce costs and our budget was reduced by X amount, and so we had to go and change that, or we had to remove that, or this business process, we're going to digitize that, so we had to create some stuff, or this team and this team and this team are all merging because we're all going to move over here, so we have to standardize everything. And you kind of look at it, and all of this stuff is really, as I say, it's that sort of reacting, isn't it? Not order taking as such, but you think, well, that's 70% of our effort and investment and time and thinking is going into this stuff that is sort of just these received. You're always going to get that, of course, because that's kind of the nature of working in a business. But again, where can you see opportunities and think about, again, this idea of what's differentiating, what's going to create real value, what are we trying to become more of, and again, often L&D is in a great opportunity. It's very well placed, perhaps more than it realizes, to kind of join the dots. It's often got a kind of a line into the strategy stuff. It's got a line into perhaps where some of the change initiatives are coming. It can see the bigger picture. And then you think, well, okay, if we put all this in a Venn diagram, there's some really common, or a word cloud, some really common reoccurring challenges and issues and opportunities here. What are we actually doing in those spaces? Who are we working with? Who wants to go first? Who's pushing hardest? Let's go to them. Shun the non-believers. Let's start there. And over time, you can kind of get this throw weight, this sort of leverage, become more than the sum of the parts, hopefully.
Yeah, I think some useful things to where you can pick those new things you can doing and pick the relevance, and that element of lots of learning teams almost having the history of the scaffolding of running around fixing past problems and doing things that were absolutely right at the time, but have maybe lived beyond their life cycle or their usefulness, or not adding that value that they first did. So it might be that you've had a sales program that's been pushed into a program that was great, that created a level of consistency, but we no longer need to deliver that in the same way because we've got you've got a common way of doing things. You just need to build, edge and evolve, not just continue to roll out the same things. There was one particular program I remember inheriting, and it came from really great intentions. So this was an organization where people had been there a very long time, so they were running this sort of leadership development program to bring outside thinking in and try and create innovation, because these people hadn't been anywhere else generally as a business. However, the business had grown and evolved over the 5 years that had been running, and now most of the people being pushed through that program had been lots of other places, and there was so they were now pushing that down into the rest of the organization, and those people actually needed very different stuff. They needed to understand their heritage, the organization, more than they needed to be pushed to look outside, because they already bought lots of outside thinking. And I think it's just simple things like that, where you're inheriting what has been a very successful program at some point, but as you said, if it's our own kid, we love that. We want to cherish it. We want to keep it. And sometimes you come in and go, that kid's no longer appropriate for this, but it's still someone else's baby. It's still someone else's, something they've put their heart and soul into. So there's a lot of things that you need to move, but it's how you evolve and change those things. And that's about your skill, your influence, your political awareness, your emotional intelligence. So there's a whole load of stuff beyond knowing what's the right thing to do and identifying that, and it's helping move people with you.
I guess if you to sort of sum up, and this is absolute heresy, but that's fine. It's fine. You said, well, if we're going to look at this, we're going to consciously try and do two things. We're going to try and move our focus and energy away from productive learning, optimizing stuff we already know, towards that generative bit. What's next? How do we build an organization and a system within which people can fulfill their potential? What will that look like? Because the productive stuff, use technology, use AI, use externals, whatever, so in terms of freeing up our time and effort to enable us to put effort into the things that only we can uniquely do in the way that we're positioned, in the middle of the roundabout, as it were, shifting from productive to generative, massive opportunity. But if you're an instructional designer, if you're a project manager, if you're a program manager, and you love creating stuff, that's going to sound really difficult, and that's not what I signed up for. But one to consider. The second part of that kind of heresy sandwich is we're going to deliberately and consciously move away from education and make that the last resort. We're going to move to kind of the exposure and the experiences bit as our go-to facilitative engines that are going to help change the organization. Because, by the way, it's faster and cheaper too. But again, if you're an instructional designer, that's an awful idea. So again, I think these two kind of almost like seesaws, aren't they? Productive, generative, education to exposure and experiences. Kind of, where do you want to rebalance? Where do you want to put the weight on those two sort of seesaw scales, if you imagine them? Those two questions. There's a huge opportunity.
I think the rolling under that, it's often the value set where, because they are difficult, transformations, or, someone feels like that's where their identity is, that's where they enjoy spending
The big
time. And you're asked,
transitions, aren't they?
yeah,
Yeah,
it's a massive
yeah,
transition. And
yeah.
where I've found the best way to sort of channel that transition is if you can get down to values level. I found that most people in learning and development have common values, and if you can get down to the values of what they're there to deliver,
Absolutely.
and you can align people on the values, it helps teams to maybe see that operating in a different way can deliver those values. Is what they've done in the past is not wrong or anything different. It's just a different way of achieving those values and aligning their skills, capability, and energy to deliver those values in the same way, because there's normally a values connect around empowerment, performance, helping people, delivery, seeing people progress, seeing people achieve results. That's normally common to most L&D people. And if you can realign that, I found that really helps move some people who see themselves as this, or see themselves as a face-to-face deliverer or an instructional designer, can just help them to reposition and work through that personal change.
I agree. And if I were to summarize the summary, that's choosing to shift from management work to leadership work.
Mm-hmm.
I think, from becoming a kind of program orientated, tactic orientated delivery function, some of which is critical, of course. You can't become these kind of roving, rabble rousers just talking to people about interesting theory. No, of course we need to ground it in, we deliver stuff that materially makes a difference to the system and enables the performance of the organization. But I think a lot of what we talked about here is that mindset of, challenging our own assumptions and beliefs, and why we are where we are and where we like to hide sometimes, in order to create something more valuable, and acknowledge there's a vacuum there because it hasn't really got anybody's name on it yet, and we can claim some of this in the right way and make a huge difference, perhaps more than continuing to kind of push harder on what we're already doing.
Absolutely. And I think, Paul, thank you. So many useful sort of lenses, lessons, perspectives, and thoughts through our conversation. Just before we wrap it up, just want to think about what's coming for you next in your career. What are you looking to do?
I've done a couple of contract roles in the last 2 years. I've found myself in financial services, which has been super interesting. So kind of one led to another is often the way. But a very interesting take on, this transformation word is everywhere. But if I think of some of the things that, excuse me, we've discussed here, organizations that have come out of the financial crisis, spent the last 10 years or more kind of doubling down and literally shoring themselves up, and compliance and regulation, and now thinking about, with new competition, who are we for? What does differentiation mean? What does it mean to lead in the market again in this new world? And what does that mean from our people and our leaders? So I think I may do some more of that, although I'm certainly keen to take some of those lessons and perhaps alongside that, continue to work with other organizations that really recognize they're at that sort of crossroads tipping point moment. I think what I found in my work is, it inevitably works best when people are seeing this opportunity for themselves and see an ambition to become something different, and want to kind of try some of these new things that we've discussed. I think it's a very tricky thing to push on businesses that don't want it or aren't ready. So hopefully more of that.
Fabulous. And if people want to connect with you, follow more of your thoughts, what's the best way of them doing that?
I guess there's 3 ways. I'm still on Twitter. We're all hanging on in there. Let's see where that goes. So at Paul Jocelyn on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn, so just search me, Paul Jocelyn, on LinkedIn. And also we've mentioned a few times, which I'm grateful for, James, my blog. So if you just Google Paul Jocelyn blog, it's Paul Jocelyn at blogspot.co.uk. But if you just go into Google and search Paul Jocelyn blog, you can find it there. And if you want to follow, that would be great. So yeah, thank you.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. And just as a shortcut, we'll make sure all of those links are in the show notes below the podcast. Paul, thank you very much for joining us today.
Brilliant. Thanks, James. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Learning Reinvented podcast. We hope you enjoyed it. If you've not already done so, please follow our podcast. And if the learning effect can help you and your organisation, please do get in touch. You can find both James and Katie on LinkedIn, and our contact details are in the show notes below.